Welcome back, my friends, to another video here on the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about what kind of displays you should get for your next generation of gaming hardware. That's PS5, Xbox Series X, and the Xbox Series S. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering what kind of display you should get. I've been researching a lot lately. I want to share some of the information I've come across and just help you guys out, kind of understand, what you should be looking for in a display. I will give some recommendations at the end of this video as well, but keep in mind the main purpose is to help you know what to look for and what's maybe you're willing to sacrifice, depending on your budget, because obviously depending on your budget you might have to sacrifice things like maybe a lower refresh rate, which we're going to explain what that is in a second, or maybe the response time's a little bit higher than what's ideal. So keep that in mind. But before we jump into that, my friends, if you guys are new to the channel, we do a variety of gaming content here. We do let's plays, gameplays, gaming news. We talk about games, we play the games, best of both worlds. Sometimes I'll unbox, technology and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's usually linked to gaming in some way or another. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely keep it locked. Make sure you guys subscribe, tell your friends, all that good stuff. If you enjoy this video, if you found it useful, drop a like, dislike it if you dislike it, and we're going to jump into this. Now, it is worth noting that, while I've done a lot of research, I'm obviously no Linus Tech Tips. They are the elite of the elite here on the internet, in my opinion, when it comes to technology, but I've learned a lot and I want to share that information with you guys and do my very best to help you guys out. So we're going to talk about different things like response time, refresh rate, resolution, HDR, whether you need it or not, panels, we're going to be talking about HDMI 2.0 versus 2.1, different things like that. A lot of people are saying, you need HDMI 2.1. It's kind of a hot topic right now. We're going to answer whether you really need that, or what's the benefits of having it versus not. So we're going to cover all those bases. So first off, we're going to jump into response time. Now, if you don't know what response time is, I guess the simplest way I can put it is that it's the responsiveness between whatever your input is, whether it's keyboard and mouse, maybe it's a controller, and the responsiveness of that on screen, right? So for example, if I'm playing a game and I'm moving around, let's say I'm moving forward and then I go to move left, how many milliseconds is there between what I do on the controller and what it shows on the monitor, right? So for example, if you're really used to playing on a low response time screen and then you go to a screen that has a high response time, you are going to notice it like night and day, where one feels like super responsive, it's like almost instantaneous, and the other one feels like there's a little bit of a jankiness in there. Now, most people that have played on displays that have a high response time for the longest time, they don't really notice it. But if you've played on a monitor or a TV or whatever, some kind of display that has a low response time for long enough, and then you go back to one with a high one, you'll notice it, like I said, night and day. So that's basically the essentials of response time. So ideally, you want to look for something that has a lower response time. It could give you a little bit of an edge, for example, in PvP games, right? Like on multiplayer games, it could be the difference between how fast you're able to shoot a guy in a PvP game if you're playing a first-person shooter. So response time can matter, and it kind of, like I said, it feels better. It feels better. So that's kind of response time. Then we have refresh rate. So refresh rate is normally measured by hertz, right? So for example, my gaming monitor that I have right now, it's 144 hertz. Now, normally what that means is how fast the monitor and the display can refresh the picture, right? Now, normally that would kind of, indicate that 144 hertz means you can have up to 144 frames per second on that monitor display. That's how fast it's capable of displaying. So if you want to try to play a game in 150 on 144 hertz monitor, you're not going to be able to truly get that kind of image, right? It's not going to actually display 150 frames per second. Same thing like if you have a 60 hertz monitor and you set, a game on PC, for example, to 120, it might say that it's running at 120, but you're not going to see it in 120 because the monitor or display, whatever, if it's a TV, is only capable of refreshing up to 60 per second. You understand? For the most part, that's kind of the basics of it, if you really want to understand the basics of refresh rate. So ideally, you want a higher refresh rate as possible, the best or the better, especially since some games on next generation consoles are going to be up to 120 frames per second. If you really want to utilize that, then of course you want a higher refresh rate. Now, what does frames per second even mean? Well, the higher frames per second, the smoother a gameplay will look. So for example, if you're in 30 frames, it'll be maybe a little bit slower kind of feeling, right? And then you play in 60 frames and it feels a lot quicker, a lot more smooth, right? More fluid, I guess, is the I guess, the answer to that. Now, most people would live and die by, you know, 60 to 120 frames per second for anything. For me, I don't mind playing a game in 30 frames. If it's a story-based game, I need it usually I need it to be 60 frames usually for a multiplayer game. But definitely for a monitor, the higher response time, the better, because then it gives you that flexibility, right? If you are in if your monitor or display or whatever, I keep saying monitor, but it could be a TV, it could be any kind of display. If it is 60 hertz, for example, and you're trying to, you know, display something at 60 frames, because it can only display up to 60 hertz, sometimes you can run into something called screen tearing, where the image kind of like splits and it kind of looks like weird. Now, for the most part, you should be fine. Not everyone encounters that with a 60 hertz display, but it is something to kind of consider, that, you know, it could be a possibility. Like I said, you want to try to get something over 60 hertz. Now, it is worth noting, if you are going for, let's say, a TV, like a Samsung TV, they have this weird kind of like way of tricking consumers. So, for example, Samsung calls this thing motion rate 120 plus. That would make you believe that their display is 120 hertz. That is not the case. Normally, whatever motion rate that Samsung lists, so 120 plus, it's half of that. So if there's a TV that says motion rate 120, it normally means it's a 60 hertz monitor. And every company is a little bit different, so be sure to research, you know, really research whatever display you're kind of interested in, and make sure what the refresh rate is. So again, ideally you want something 120 hertz or higher if you want to fully utilize, you know, the games that will be capable of 120 frames per second on next gen hardware. So that's refresh rate. Then of course you have the resolution, which is a little bit simpler, right? So for the most part, you know, way back in the day we had our, like, you know, what was it, 480p or whatever, you know, your 4x3, you know, tube TV square images, right? And then we eventually had HD, which was 720p and 1080p. Now full HD is considered 1080p, which most things are in right now. Most likely you're watching this on a 1080p display. Then of course you have 1440p, which is also considered 2K. You know, it's like half of what 4K is, I guess. And then of course you have full 4K resolution as well. Now these consoles are going to be capable of 4K. Does that mean you need 4K? Not necessarily. It's all, you know, it's gonna factor into what you really looking for in a monitor or display, TV, whatever, and you know what your budget is, of course, right? So let's say you're on a smaller screen. Most people would argue that you can't see 4K compared to 2K. I would say that it's still noticeable if you have a really sharp eye, but for the average viewer, yeah, that is probably true. If you're on a smaller screen, like under 32 inches for sure, then, you know, 1440p is probably more than enough. Now, it is worth keeping in mind though, right now at the time of recording, we have confirmed that Xbox Series X and Series S will have selectable resolutions. So for example, in the Series X, you could select either from 4K, 1440p, 1080p, or even as low as 720p if you want to, but we don't know if that's going to be possible in the PS5 at the time of recording this. So it might just be 1080p or 4K like they did on the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X. Hopefully that's not the case. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think PS5 is going to allow you to select these different resolutions as well. I'd be very surprised if they don't allow that. Do keep that in mind at the time of recording this. I'll leave a pinned comment down below, you know, whenever we get official information. But right now, while I'm recording this, I don't know. So resolution, right? It all depends what you want, what you can afford. Now, sometimes if you want a 4K display and you want it to be, you know, let's say 120 hertz or higher, that's going to start costing you a little bit more. So if you want a 4K resolution, you know, for a budget price, you know, like $300, $400, $500, then normally it's going to be a 60 hertz display for the most part. There's some out there, but you're probably going to have to cheap out on something. So if you're really on a tight budget, honestly, I would go for the 1440p. You know, you'd be fine with that, and you know, just get a little bit of a higher refresh rate. I mean, it's still going to look gorgeous in 2K, even if it's not full 4K. You know, and again, you got to outweigh what means more to you. Do you want a sharper resolution, or do you want a higher frame rate, like a refresh rate, which, you know, will be capable of higher frame rates? That's kind of the thing you got to outweigh. Then, of course, we have HDR. Now, HDR is basically how bright whites can get and how dark blacks can get, and kind of, you know, it just makes the contrast of an image look a lot better. Now, that's probably a really shallow, loose way of, you know, explaining HDR. Unfortunately, not many monitors have good HDR. Now, there is one monitor that I've been looking at that I'll talk about in a second in my recommendation section that has HDR 600, which is kind of in the middle range. It's not the best and it's not the worst. Now, keep in mind, some companies, just like the refresh rate, they'll kind of have this whole, you know, marketing thing where it's like HDR10 or HDR this or that. And a lot of the times those are just, you know, it's just bogus. For example, my PC monitor is a 4K monitor. It's only 60 hertz, and it says HDR10. It has a fake HDR. It's not true HDR. And if I turn this fake HDR on this monitor, if I turn it on, it looks like trash. So be wary of that. Look for things that say like HDR 200, 400, 600. You know, you can look all that up online, you know, all the actual true HDR. So HDR 600 is the highest I've personally seen with an actual monitor. Gets much higher with TVs. I don't know why it's like that with monitors, but it is for whatever reason. So keep that in mind. So that's that. And then of course we have panels. Now panels are normally mostly for like monitors. Of course there's different kind of panels for TVs, like, you know, LED and OLED and stuff. Obviously a lot of OLED panels are like the most beautiful panels, a lot of people would say, but also the most expensive. So keep that in mind. For the most part, most modern TVs have really nice looking panels. You know, again, that's something you kind of have to research and outweigh yourself. I can't give you every single one. Like I said, I can give you some recommendations at the end of this video, but ultimately I'm trying to give you guys the tools to find the best display for your needs. Now, as far as monitors go, there's three main displays. There's TN, VA, and IPS. Now, if I were to explain this in the most simplistic way that anybody can understand, I would explain it in the way of painting a car, right? If you were to paint a car, you have three kinds of finishes for the most part. You have your matte finish, which is more of like a kind of flat looking finish. You have your normal kind of paint, which is kind of like it's a little bit shinier, right? And then you have your gloss, which is like really shiny. I would say that TN, VA, and IPS are kind of like that. The TN being more of like a matte looking kind of finish, right? It's a little bit kind of flatter. It's not as shiny. That's kind of what I've been using for a while. You have a VA panel, which I don't think I've used a VA myself, which is kind of in the middle of TN and IPS. It's kind of like the middle ground. Tries to take a little bit from both. And then you have IPS, which is kind of like that shiny, glossy kind of thing, right? Now, unfortunately, excuse me, with IPS, there's a couple things you have to be wary of, right? One of the things is IPS glow. Now, I'll try to throw an image up on screen to show you guys an example of IPS glow, which normally won't really matter unless it's a really, really dark scene where you can just kind of see there's kind of like a glow coming from like the backlight of the monitor. And again, for the most part, it's not a big deal. I don't think it's something that will bug most people. The other thing is if you cheap out on an IPS monitor or display, some of them have this other thing that can happen called backlight bleed. Now, bleed is a little bit different and it's really, really annoying. I'll try to throw up a picture on screen of my monitor that ended up having bleed. Thankfully, this is just my PC monitor. It's not the one I game on. Still super annoying. So be wary of that being a possibility, but it doesn't mean that IPS panels will have that, especially now a lot of the newer IPS technology, you know, they've improved. And now for the most part, if I was to make this video a while ago, I would have had to tell you, you know, oh, well, IPS has like, you know, slower refresh rates than the TN panel. TN is much faster refresh rates, but that's not the case now. You know, 5 years ago, that would have been the case. Now, all these panels are pretty similar and they have similar refresh rates. You know, there's IPS panels with 144 hertz now. So that is something to keep in mind as well. But typically, you know, you might be paying a little bit more for, like, let's say an IPS panel. Also worth noting, IPS panels are normally more color accurate. So there's, you know, the colors are, again, there's more colors, right? The colors it can display, there's more of it. There's more, again, it's more accurate, right? Where a TN panel, because it has that matte look, it's more flat looking, it's not as color accurate. So, you know, keep that in mind as well when you're looking for a panel type, if you're looking for a monitor. Like I said, for, you know, TVs and stuff, you shouldn't have much of a problem. Most TVs look fine. And, you know, of course, if you want to go for the best of the best for a TV, OLED is the way to go. So that's kind of panels. Now let's talk about HDMI 2.0 versus 2.1. Now this has been a huge topic because these next generations of consoles are going to be HDMI 2.1 compatible, and everybody's like, dude, you need an HDMI 2.1 you know, display. Now, if you're going for a monitor like I am, there's pretty much, well, there's no HDMI 2.1 monitors at the time of recording this. That's something you probably will be able to find with, you know, like, let's say a TV or something like that, but not something you can find at all right now at the time of recording for a monitor. Those aren't coming till like 2021. Now, do you need it? Yes and no. It depends on what you want. So HDMI 2.0 versus 2.1. The difference is, In HDMI 2.1, it is capable of VRR, which is variable refresh rate. It is also capable of having 4K resolution up to 120 hertz. Now, HDMI 2.0 doesn't have VRR, variable refresh rate, and it's only capable of 4K 60 hertz. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get higher refresh rates with 4K, with other resolutions on an HDMI 2.0. So for example, HDMI 2.0, 4K 60, but if you're in 1440p, it's 120 hertz. If you're in 1080p, it's up to 240 hertz over HDMI 2.0. So for the most part, I don't think in that regard, if that is your biggest concern, I don't think you need an HDMI 2.1 display because most games probably won't hit 4K 120 on next generation of consoles. There's a couple games that are saying that they will. I think Halo Infinite was one of them that just said it's going to be 4K 120, but I think it's going to be rare. And personally, I think you'll be fine at 60 hertz if you're in 4K. And if you really want more than 60, then you could always dumb it down to 1440p, which is 2K, and then you'll have up to 120 hertz. You'll have that 120 frames, right? Which isn't a big jump in resolution. Again, it depends. If you really want, then and you want a monitor like that, you're gonna have to wait. If you want a TV like that, there are TVs with HDMI 2.1, but monitors are lacking because they normally focus on display ports over the HDMI ports, because most people use display ports when they're hooking it up to a PC. But then variable refresh rate is the other thing. Now, variable refresh rate allows the game basically to adjust depending on the scenes going on, so it can adjust on the fly basically, which that can allow you to have a little bit of a smoother gameplay experience. Now, I don't think it's a huge deal. I don't think it's personally for me, it's not something to break HDMI 2.0 versus 2.1 over. Will it give you a little bit of a smoother experience? Yes. Is it the end of the world if you don't have that capability? I don't think so. But again, that's something for you to outweigh. Again, you can look up more, in-depth details about VRR online, but that's kind of the basic, simplistic kind of way of explaining what that is. So if you want VRR, you need HDMI 2.1. If you don't care about it, you're fine with HDMI 2.0. If you want to have 120 hertz at 4K, you need HDMI 2.1, but again, HDMI 2.0 can do higher refresh rates at 1440p, 120 hertz, or like I said, 1080p at 240. It's only locked to 60 if you're in 4K. So that's kind of the difference between HDMI 2.0 versus 2.1. And I think that covers the main part of this video. So I think that hopefully gives you enough information to know what kind of screens to look for. I'll give you guys a couple recommendations, a couple of things that I've been looking at really quick, but again, ultimately you have to kind of look into what fits your budget, your needs, and all that good stuff, and kind of decide from there. So for TVs, I heard the Samsung CX series are apparently very good TVs. A lot of people have been saying they are great TVs. Now I don't know what the pricing is like. I think those might be a little bit more expensive, but if you really want a really good TV, those are OLED TVs, panels as well, so they look really good if you want the best of the best and you can afford it. So those are very good for for TVs. I like some of the mid-range to upper range Sony stuff as well. Haven't tested a lot of the lower stuff. I think like the XBR series, if I remember right, for Sony are really great TVs. That's kind of what we have for our 4K TV ourselves, and I really love it. When I had just a 1080p TV, I had the XBR model or whatever as well, and I feel like the XBR series are really good for TVs. Again, I'm not as well versed in TVs, but those are a couple recommendations. Again, you got to kind of take what the information I've given you and look for what suits you best. I'll give you guys a couple monitors though, because I've been looking for a monitor personally, so I'll give you guys a couple different ones to look at. Now, I've been looking at a couple different ones. So the BenQ EX2780Q, it's a 1440p IPS panel, 144 hertz. It says HDRI, which is basically fake the HDR, so don't expect any great HDR out of it. Keep in mind with monitors, most of the time they don't have speakers, and if they have speakers, they suck. So you're probably going to want to make sure you have headphones or some kind of external speakers to hook up to them. If they do have a port, make sure they have that port. If you are gaming on PS5, Xbox Series X, or Xbox Series S, they do have options to plug in your headset directly into the controller anyways, so you don't need it to plug it into your display. So that's kind of around. I'm not sure what it is in US. Canadian, it's a little bit cheaper. Well, not cheaper, more expensive. It's normally around like $700 Canadian, which I think is probably like $500 USD. Again, I'm in Canada, so keep that in mind. Another one, now these are kind of a two-in-one. The LG GL850 is a great 1440p monitor by LG. Now, it's labeled as 1 millisecond, but actually the only way to get that 1 millisecond response time is if you put on this setting that it's called like faster or whatever. But if you put on that high setting, based on reviews I've seen, you apparently get a lot of screen tearing, so you don't want to have it on this fastest setting. You want to have it on just fast, and in which case, if you don't have it on this super high setting, which causes no, ghosting, actually, not screen tearing, it causes ghosting, which is really annoying, which is a whole other topic to get into, which again, it's kind of like when you move, a character will look like there's a ghost kind of trailing behind them, for example, right? So it causes ghosting at this higher setting. So to have a setting that has no ghosting, normally the response time will be around probably 4 or 5 milliseconds, which is still really, really good. So keep that in mind. It does say 1 millisecond, but typically if you want, you know, your image to look good, you'd be running around 5 milliseconds display. So the other one is actually its big brother, which is the LG Ultragear as well. It's called the LG GN950, and again, this is basically the same monitor for the most part, but it's the 4K version, whereas the 1440p version doesn't really have HDR, and if it does, it has like that fake HDR. The 4K version has HDR 600. I was talking about earlier that there's HDR 600 monitors. This is the one. Now, there's probably some other monitors out there as well, but these are kind of like the main three I've seen. With this 4K one, it's similar. It's advertised 1 millisecond, but to have the setting that doesn't cause ghosting, you'll be running around 4 or 5 milliseconds, you know, give or take. It does have 144 hertz. It is an IPS, monitor display, so keep that in mind as well. And I've heard amazing things about both these monitors. So if you do want a 1440p, the LG GL850 is a great choice. If you want the 4K, the LG GN950 is also a great choice. From what I've done, my research, these seem to be like the two best monitors out there, followed up by that BenQ EX27. But again, these are all 27-inch monitors as well. So if you want something smaller or bigger, then I don't know, you're gonna have to, I guess, look into that yourself. But so those are kind of some of my recommendations. Let me know and let everybody else know in the comment section below if you have any other recommendations, and if I missed anything in this video. I hope I gave you guys enough information to go off to kind of make your own informative decision on what kind of display to upgrade for your next generation of gaming console. So if you do have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. And like I said, if you have anything to add or take away or whatever, you could also comment that down below. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to drop it a like, dislike it if you didn't like it. And if you want to stick around, make sure to subscribe, tell your friends who can continue growing the community. Check out all the social links down below and all that good stuff. And we're going to be unboxing the new consoles, gameplay, different things, walkthroughs, of the UIs, and just a bunch of different stuff. It's going to be a good time. So keep it locked. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys soon. And until the next one, my friends, game on.